Camilla is no longer just the king's wife. She never really was. William watched everything happen, and for a long time he said nothing. But that silence has finally broken. The moves Camilla has been making, the access she's been controlling, the influence she's been accumulating, has pushed William to a breaking point. When the king's cancer became public knowledge in February 2024, the official narrative was one of unity, a family pulling together, a monarch stepping back temporarily while he healed. But behind that carefully managed image, something else was already in motion. Camilla, according to royal insiders, moved with a speed and precision that caught even senior palace aides off guard. Within weeks of the diagnosis being announced, she had quietly repositioned herself at the center of nearly every significant decision flowing in and out of the palace. Not loudly, not visibly, quietly. That word keeps appearing in accounts from those who watched it happen. She began attending briefings she had never previously been included in. She started weighing in on matters of royal scheduling, staff appointments, and public communications, areas that had historically sat firmly within the domain of the heir and his team. But it didn't stop there. Sources close to Kensington Palace report that William began noticing something deeply unsettling. Information that should have reached him, updates on his father's condition, discussions about the monarchy's operational future, was being filtered, delayed, sometimes not arriving at all. And at the center of that filter, reportedly, was Camilla. This is not a woman who stumbled into influence. Royal watchers have long noted that Camilla has spent 2 decades studying the institution she married into, its pressure points, its loyalties, its unspoken rules. She knows which staff members matter. She knows which courtiers hold real sway. And she knows, perhaps better than anyone, that in the British monarchy, access is everything. Control who gets to the king, and you control the king. What makes this moment particularly significant is the timing. Charles, weakened by treatment and increasingly reliant on those closest to him, was never more vulnerable to this kind of influence than he was in those early months of 2024. And Camilla, sources say, understood that perfectly. She had waited years for a moment like this, a moment when the palace needed a steady hand, a moment when Charles needed someone he trusted completely, a moment when the usual checks and balances, the heir, the senior staff, the broader family, were distracted by grief, fear, and uncertainty. She stepped into that moment without hesitation, and by the time anyone fully understood what had happened, the power inside Buckingham Palace had already shifted. William, sources say, was among the last to realize it, but when he did, everything changed. Here is something that has never been reported quite this directly. William is being kept out, not physically, but in the ways that actually matter inside a royal household. The Prince of Wales has found himself increasingly on the outside of conversations he has every right to be part of. And the pattern, sources say, is not accidental. There is a long-established understanding within the British monarchy that the sovereign and the heir operate in close coordination, not just as family, but as institutional partners. The heir is briefed, the heir is consulted, the heir is prepared. This is how the machine sustains itself across generations, by ensuring that the next king is never caught unprepared when the moment arrives. But that understanding, according to those familiar with the current dynamic, has been quietly eroding. Since Charles's illness, William has found himself receiving less information, not more. Requests from his Kensington Palace team for updates on key royal matters have reportedly been met with delays, vague responses, or in some cases silence. Meetings that would traditionally have included the Prince of Wales have proceeded without him. Decisions about the public face of the monarchy, which engagements to prioritize, which causes to champion, how to manage the king's reduced capacity, have been made without his input. But here is what makes this more than just an administrative frustration. Some of those decisions, sources say, directly affect William's own future role. There are reports that conversations have taken place inside the palace about the long-term shape of the institution, conversations about staffing, about the slimmed-down monarchy Charles once championed, about which royal roles carry real weight and which do not. William, reportedly, has not been in the room for those conversations. Camilla has. This is the detail that sources say has cut deepest. It is one thing to feel excluded from day-to-day palace operations. It is another entirely to discover that the future of the institution you are set to inherit is being shaped without you by a woman who will have no formal role in it once Charles is gone. That is the reality William is now confronting, and it raises a question that nobody inside the palace seems willing to answer directly. Who is actually running Buckingham Palace right now? Because the evidence, fragmentary but consistent, points less toward a convalescing king managing his affairs from a distance, and more toward a queen who has stepped into a vacuum and shown no particular inclination to step back out. William, sources say, has reached the same conclusion, and he is not prepared to let it stand. The most painful part of this story is not the power struggle, it is the man caught inside it. King Charles III is by every account a deeply complicated figure, a man who spent decades waiting for a crown that never seemed to arrive, a man who remade himself slowly and painfully from one of the most unpopular royals in modern history into a king who commanded genuine respect, and a man who, at the moment of his greatest vulnerability, finds himself caught between the two people he loves most, his wife and his son. The nature of Charles's illness has never been fully disclosed. Buckingham Palace confirmed cancer in February 2024, but declined to specify the type, citing privacy. What has emerged through sources, however, is a picture of a king whose capacity has been significantly reduced, not permanently, but enough to matter, enough to create gaps. And in a royal household, gaps are never empty for long. Those who know Charles well describe a man who has always been susceptible to the influence of whoever is closest to him. It is not a weakness, exactly. It is the inevitable consequence of a life lived largely without genuine intimacy. A man who, when he finally finds someone he trusts completely, leans into that trust with everything he has. With Diana, that dynamic ended in catastrophe. With Camilla, it has defined his adult life. She is, by his own admission, the one person who has always understood him. But that profound dependence, sources say, is now being used in ways Charles may not fully perceive, because Charles, according to those close to him, does not see what William sees. He does not experience Camilla's expanding influence as a power grab. He experiences it as love, as a devoted wife stepping up during the hardest chapter of his life. And that, sources say, is precisely what makes this situation so difficult to resolve. You cannot go to a sick man and tell him his wife is accumulating power at his son's expense. Not easily. Not without fracturing something irreparable. William reportedly understands this. He has approached his father carefully, obliquely, raising concerns without triggering the full confrontation that would force Charles to choose. But that careful approach, sources say, has its limits, because while William has been careful, Camilla has not been idle, and every week that passes without a direct reckoning is another week in which the balance inside that palace shifts a little further in her direction. Charles, for now, remains in the middle, loving both, seeing neither clearly. What is happening now did begin a long time ago, actually. When Diana, Princess of Wales, died in Paris in August 1997, William was 15 years old. He stood in front of the world and buried his mother. And he did it knowing, as the entire world knew, that the woman who had helped destroy his parents' marriage was waiting quietly in the background. Camilla Parker Bowles did not attend Diana's funeral. She was advised not to. Public feeling was so hostile, so raw, so overwhelming in those days immediately after the crash, that her presence would have been unthinkable. But she was there in every other sense, in the whispered conversations, in the complicated grief of a family that had never been straightforward, in the eyes of a 15-year-old boy who would not forget. William has never publicly attacked Camilla. That is not his way, and it is not the monarchy's way. But those who have watched him closely over the years describe a man who has tolerated her presence rather than welcomed it, who has been civil where Harry, remarkably, was warmer, and who has never fully lowered the wall that went up in 1997. There were small signs over the years if you knew where to look. When Charles and Camilla married in April 2005, William attended and gave his public blessing. But sources from that period describe a young man who processed that day with gritted teeth acceptance rather than genuine joy. He understood what it meant for his father. He was less certain what it meant for his mother's memory. Over the following years, a fragile civility developed. Camilla was careful around William. She did not overreach. She did not attempt to play any kind of maternal role. She has spoken publicly about deliberately keeping her distance, understanding that the terrain was mined, and for a long time that arrangement held. But the arrangement was always built on a specific understanding. Camilla would be Charles's wife. She would not be a power within the institution. She would not insert herself into the operational machinery of the monarchy. She would not position herself between the king and his heir. That was the unspoken deal. And sources say it is precisely that deal which William now believes has been broken, because what he is witnessing is not a devoted wife supporting a sick husband. What he is witnessing, sources say, is something he has feared since he was old enough to understand how the palace works. A woman who was let inside the walls, slowly, carefully, with every assurance of good intentions, using that access to reshape the institution around herself. Diana, in her famous 1995 Panorama interview, spoke about there being 3 people in her marriage. William was 12 when he watched that interview. He is 42 now. And sources say he cannot shake the feeling that history, in its own strange way, is repeating itself, not in the same form, but in the same pattern. For months, William kept his concerns inside Kensington Palace, but then something happened that forced his hand. The precise details remain closely guarded, but sources familiar with the situation describe a specific moment, not a gradual escalation, but a single incident that shifted William's approach from cautious observation to direct action. What is known is this. Sometime in the latter half of 2024, William became aware of a decision that had been made at the palace level, a significant decision touching directly on the future shape of the monarchy that he had not been consulted on, not informed after the fact, not briefed in advance, simply excluded. And the decision, sources say, bore the unmistakable hallmarks of Camilla's influence. William's response was not public. It was not a statement, not a leak to a sympathetic journalist, not a carefully timed appearance designed to send a message. It was a conversation, a direct, private, reportedly tense conversation with his father. Those with knowledge of that exchange describe it as one of the most significant moments in the private history of the current royal family. A son telling a father, in the plainest possible terms, that something was wrong inside his own house. William, according to sources, did not attack Camilla by name. He is too careful for that, too aware of how such a conversation could be weaponized. But he made his concerns unmistakably clear. He spoke about access, about information flow, about the constitutional importance of the heir being properly involved in the operational life of the monarchy. He spoke, sources say, like a man who had prepared for this conversation for a very long time. Charles's response is described as pained. He did not dismiss William's concerns, but he did not immediately act on them either. He is a man who has spent his entire life avoiding direct confrontation, who processes conflict slowly, who needs time to reach conclusions that others arrive at instinctively. And so he did what Charles typically does in moments of pressure. He listened, he expressed understanding, and he asked for time. But here is what sources say William took from that conversation. not reassurance, not resolution, a warning, because in the days that followed, according to those familiar with the palace dynamic, nothing changed. The information flow did not improve, the access did not widen, and Camilla, if anything, seemed to consolidate further rather than pull back, which told William everything he needed to know. His father had heard him, his father had understood him, but his father had chosen, at least for now, to prioritize the peace of his marriage over the concerns of his heir. It is a choice Charles may not fully recognize he is making, but William, sources say, recognizes it with painful clarity, and it has changed something fundamental in how he views what is coming next. Here is the question that nobody inside the palace is asking out loud, but everyone is thinking. What does Camilla actually want? The easy answer is that she wants what she has always wanted. Security, legitimacy, a place in history that is defined by something other than the affair that preceded it. And to a significant degree, she has already achieved that. She is queen. Her title is no longer the carefully hedged queen consort that was once floated as a compromise. She is Queen Camilla, full stop. And the palace made that position unambiguous at the coronation in May 2023. But sources suggest that what Camilla wants now goes beyond a title. There are reports, unconfirmed, but persistent, that Camilla has expressed interest in shaping what the monarchy looks like after Charles, not in a formal sense. She is not delusional about her position. She understands that when Charles dies, her formal role ends, but influence is not the same as formal power, and the groundwork for influence can be laid long before it is needed. Sources say Camilla has been cultivating relationships with key figures in the palace machinery, courtiers, communications staff, senior household aides, in ways that go well beyond what her role strictly requires. She has been building loyalty, and loyalty, in a royal household, is the currency that outlasts any single reign. There is also the question of her legacy. Camilla has spoken in recent years about the causes she wants to be remembered for: literacy, domestic abuse awareness, the welfare of victims of sexual violence. These are not cynical choices. By all accounts, she cares about them genuinely, but they are also choices that position her as a serious, substantive public figure rather than a footnote to someone else's story. She is writing her own chapter, and sources say she intends it to be a long one. What William makes of all this is not difficult to imagine. He is a man preparing to be king. He is a man who has spent his entire adult life navigating the complicated legacy of his parents' marriage, and he is now watching the woman at the center of that legacy, quietly positioning herself for a future that extends well beyond his father's reign. That is not something he is willing to accommodate. Because a king, William understands, cannot afford to inherit someone else's power structure. He will need to build his own, and that means the reckoning that has been quietly building inside the palace walls cannot be deferred forever. The institution is already navigating an extraordinary set of pressures: a king managing a serious illness, an heir who is increasingly asserting himself as a sovereign in waiting, a queen whose role and reach are the subject of intense private debate, and a global audience that is watching every public appearance, every body language cue, every carefully worded statement for signs of what is really happening beneath the surface. The monarchy has survived worse. Technically, it survived abdication, it survived Diana, it survived the years of open warfare between Charles and the Wales household that defined the 1990s, but each of those crises left marks. Each one cost the institution something it never fully recovered: public trust, moral authority, the sense that the family at the center of it all was something worth believing in. What is unfolding now is different in one important respect. It is happening at the exact moment when the monarchy can least afford instability. Charles's reign was always going to be a transitional one, a bridge between the certainties of Elizabeth's era and whatever William's monarchy will become. But a bridge only works if both ends are stable. Right now, sources say they are not. On one side, a king who is unwell and caught between his wife and his son. On the other, an heir who is increasingly convinced that the house he is set to inherit has been compromised from within. And in the middle, a queen who shows no sign of stepping back. Something will have to give. It always does. Inside institutions this old, this proud, and this resistant to change. The question is not whether the balance of power inside Buckingham Palace will shift. It already is shifting. The question is whether it shifts on William's terms or someone else's. What do you think? Has Camilla gone too far? Or is she simply doing what any devoted wife would do in her position?